Hello and welcome to MAN301 Strategic Management Week 8. This is the lecture for Week 8. It's the beginning of the lecture. And in the beginning of the lecture, we're just going to cover the first two objectives and also an introduction. This week deals with cooperative strategy. Cooperative strategy is the fifth topic we've dealt with in the area of strategy formulation within our strategic management framework. So we've looked at business level strategy, competitive dynamics, corporate level strategy, international strategy, and this week, cooperative strategy. Next week, we're going to look at implementation and control of strategy, also part of the strategic management framework. As per usual, these slides are an adaptation of the slides and resources that are provided for your textbook, and I've also added a range of issues and additional information into the slides. Supporting this lecture are multiple video cases. So those multiple video cases again will be interspersed between sections. Though this week, one of the things that you may find easier to do is look at the lecture component in a more holistic way across the four objectives, and then look at the videos. It's up to you about those supporting videos. On the unit website, there is the information about this lecture, the information about the tutorials and your forum activity, which will be due on Friday the 15th. The tutorial activities, of course, are in the week of following this lecture, and that will be on Wednesday the 13th. And then as well as that, I've got the resources, the slides, and obviously where you're looking, these lecture recordings. So our four objectives are to define cooperative strategy and explain why firms use them, define and discuss three types of strategic alliances, and then name the business level cooperative strategies and describe their use, and the corporate level cooperative strategies that firms use, that are diversified use to implement cooperative relationships. This topic draws on a range of other topics we've already covered, because one of the purposes of strategic alliances, one of the purposes of cooperative strategy, indeed, one of the purposes of mergers and acquisitions, which we don't deal with in this year's version of the course, is to gain access to the value chain of other companies, to cooperate either at a functional, a business, or a cooperative level with other companies. Sometimes that cooperation can be industry-wide. Sometimes that cooperation can be long-term. Sometimes it can be short-term. Sometimes it can be between one or two companies. Sometimes it can be just between sections of one company or another company. But overall, what you are trying to do is gain competitive advantage through your relationships with other companies and organizations. So let's look at Objective 1. Define cooperative strategies and explain why firms use them. Well, we already know that a strategy is the way firms allocate their resources to achieve a strategic outcome. Cooperative strategy is a strategy when the firm works together, or firms work together, to achieve a shared objective, when firms work together to achieve a shared objective. Now, a strategic alliance is the primary form of cooperative strategy. And some strategic alliances can be equity-based. They have money coming in from, or resources coming in from both companies. They may form a separate organization. Those things are called joint ventures. So they're a special type of strategic alliance. So it's the primary type, the main type of cooperative strategy, and it allows the firm to leverage the existing resources and capabilities and competencies, its own existing corporate resources, capabilities and competencies, and access partners resources, capabilities, and competencies, and also by the combination of those relationships, by the combination of what those firms can do. They develop additional resources and capabilities that may be the foundation of a new competitive advantage. Now, I know that's broad and general at the moment, but I think you can understand the concept of two firms that have complementary competencies working together might give you an outcome through the discussion we've had on value chains and accessing other value chains and supply chains. But as well as that, two firms can work together to develop a new source of competitive advantage, a new core competency, new resources, new capabilities. The reasons that firms enter strategic alliances can, like we've talked about before in other markets, and other strategy formulation decisions, be driven by the nature of the market. If you are in a slow cycle market, a market that does not change quickly, you may want to form an alliance with a company that is already in that market because it will give you access to that market. You may want to access the market without as much investment through a franchise relationship. Or you may want to bring more than one company that is already in this slow cycle market together to maintain market stability. So it may be in the form of creating standards that actually affects all levels of market cycle. But entry standards, licensing, technology standards can be used to further protect the players in the market, in that industry, from others entering that industry. If we think about the home insulation market in Australia, there are two companies that dominate the production of fiberglass and rock wool. You know, those big bats that you put into the are made out of fiberglass or made out of rock wool, or sometimes made out of other substances that you put into your roof or your walls to keep your house insulated from heat and cold. Those two companies, in the way they've developed their strategic alliance through their industry association, there's actually technically four, but they're really two, have used that alliance and the deaths of some people installing another form of insulation under a government subsidy, which is the aluminium sheet reflected, or insulation, or steel sheeting reflected insulation, which conducts electricity, and some people working the roof are electrocuted. They've used their standards as a protection against entry standards related to the other competitors who are not part of that industry alliance. So they've used their rock wool fiberglass association to set standards. But of course, we know technology has compliance standards as well, and you can sometimes get smaller groups that are competing against each other on one or other side. In a fast cycle market, you may form an alliance to develop new goods and services. We see that in technology alliances all the time. You may want to speed up market entry, maintain market leadership, form an industrial technology standard, share risky research and development or R&D expenses. Think of OLED or the standards for Wi-Fi or the standards for QLED. Over at 5G, or overcome uncertainty. In a standard size market, you're going into an alliance to gain market power because the industry may be over capacity, so you want to form alliances that reduce the number of competitors and maybe downsize the production. Gain access, so you're no longer competing each other, and the only way to compete is by reducing price. Gain access to complementary resources, something they have in their supply chain or they have in their distribution chain. manufacturing, any resource that fits within the value chain, establish better economies of scale by reaching critical mass, overcome trade barriers that might exist because an alliance partner is operating in one country and you're operating in another country. You come up with a joint way to manufacture across borders that will enable you to service both markets. It's often done in services firms too, like accounting and law. Meet competitive challenges from your competitors by getting to a certain critical size or to enable you to compete directly. Pool resources for very large capital projects, or learn new business techniques. So all those things are the way that markets work and how they can encourage firms or incentivize firms to go into a strategic alliance. Now, I'm being very careful in the way I've said this too. One of the reasons for being so careful in the way I've explained this is that this model, which is a simplification of reality, something I say almost every week, you can see how there are some overlaps between each of these levels. I said establishing standards for slow cycle. Establishing technology standards is a fast cycle. So establishing standards of different formats goes at every level of every market. So this is not one of those four-way separated models. There are clearly most likely reasons for a slow, a fast, and a standard cycle market, for a firm in a slow, a fast, or a standard cycle market to seek to establish a strategic alliance. But there's a fair amount of blurring between those motivations as well. So let's look at objective 2. Define the 3 types of strategic alliance. A joint venture is a strategic alliance where 2 firms take an equity position. Normally, or 2 or more firms, they form a legally independent company to share some of their resources and capabilities to develop a competitive advantage. So Nissan and Mitsubishi have a joint venture in Thailand to make light trucks. They make them on the same production line. Toyota and Subaru develop a sports car together to save developmental cost and distribution cost. Hyundai and Kia, which have a 30% equity ownership, Hyundai has a 30% equity ownership of Kia, share platform development. They create a separate company to do that. BMW and a number of other European car companies purchased as a joint venture one of the sat-nav systems, not Apple, not Google Maps, because they wanted to have a critical mass to be able to compete against Apple and Google Maps when they came into the marketplace for their navigation. Now they've moved on from that, of course, now. But we're seeing strategic alliances between organisations too. Some of the examples I've given you here in joint ventures are things like Renault and Nissan. Now, Renault and Nissan's strategic alliance relationship has evolved over time, so I've definitely given you a video to look at on those. An equity strategic alliance is when 2 or more firms own different percentages of equity in a new venture. Those are traditional accounting definitions. In strategy, they're often dealt with a little bit more flexibly than that. But joint ventures and equity strategic alliances both involve equity. Joint ventures tend to be equal amounts of funding. Equity strategic alliances tend to be different amounts of funding. A firm will own 50% or 20% or 10% or whatever. Non-equity strategic alliances are contractual agreements between a company to supply or produce or distribute a firm's goods and services without equity sharing. If we look at those 3 models, again, they're a simplification of reality. BHP, often which owns the right to, say, develop steel. to iron ore and then to smelt steel or to export iron nuggets and iron ore. They may have this whole site, and they may go in with a partner, for example, a Japanese smelter that manufactures steel. They may develop a section of that together in a contractual relationship, but is really a joint venture firm operating on one part of BHP's steel ore deposit, iron ore deposit, or one of BHP's iron ore deposits. So, and in fact, if you look at companies like BHP, frequently, and also companies that are related to, say, oil and gas, frequently the partnership development comes from their customers being engaged in the development of a particular resource when the market is available, and guaranteeing in a contractual way that they will take a particular amount of the output of that mine. But sometimes they also take an equity position in the development of a particular site. So you can get far more complex interactions between these different types of strategic alliances. So when you're looking at the illustrative videos on the site, when you're looking at the video cases, you will sometimes see things and you'll go, oh, what type of alliance is that? Because you will be able to sometimes argue it's one or the other form. And part of the reason for you being able to argue at different levels is because even though we've said there's these three types of alliance, there's also the nature of the alliance, whether it's at business level, whether it's at corporate level. And we're focusing in this course on business and corporate level. Now, of course, there are some functional level alliances that sometimes also exist, say for marketing or distribution or service or transfer or whatever. So we can have those as well. But in this strategic management course, we're not focusing quite as much on those lower level functional within value chain decisions. Though, of course, a combination of things that you do within your value chain can, in fact, lead you to having a business-level cooperative strategy. So I don't want to blur it too much, but that's why it's complex to define all three of these. And that's why we've kept a broad definition of a joint venture being two or more companies with equal stakes, an equity alliance being two or more with different perceptions of equity, and a non-equity alliance being two or more firms that form an alliance on a contractual agreement. Okay, that's the introduction. That's objective 1 and 2. I'm going to finish this section here. Then there'll be some examples that you can look at, some video case examples. And when you come back, we're going to look at objective 3, which looks at business level strategy.